On your screen right now, there's 300 circles, with each circle representing 1,000 people, signifying the population of the entire city of Newcastle in the 1930s. The highlighted circles constitute how many of those Geordies were inside St James's Park to watch their Division 1 game against Chelsea, with nearly 25% of the entire city being inside the ground. To put that into perspective, if the same proportion of people in London were to watch a single football game, over 2 million people would be in attendance. That's 23 Wembley stadiums at full capacity, or 72% of the entire population of World Cup host Qatar. Even in the modern day, nearly 18% of Newcastle's population make it to ground each week to support their side. It's clear to see that Newcastle United have one of the most loyal fan bases out there, who are infinitely proud to be part of the Toon Army. And it's not just their fans that are great, the club have won. A lot. Think I'm exaggerating? They're the 9th most successful team in England and have won more major honours than Italian giants Napoli. Oh, and they're also the richest club in world football. So let's take a look into the history of Newcastle United. Rewind nearly 150 years to 1877 and the first football club in Newcastle was formed. Over the next few years various teams have been created in the city, but in 1881 the first of 2 clubs were founded, which would change football in Newcastle forever. Newcastle East End were the first professional club in the city, formed in November 1881. A little less than a year later, and Newcastle West End were formed, creating a rivalry between the two sides. However, within just 10 years, Newcastle West End found themselves with deep financial problems and faced going extinct. Not wanting that to happen, the club made a decision which would shock the city. They requested to merge with Newcastle East, with the East Club absorbing all of the assets of Newcastle West, the most important of these assets being the ground, St James's Park. And so on December 9th, 1892, Newcastle United were formed, and football in England has never been the same since. With there now just being one real club in the city, Newcastle United found themselves without a rival. Luckily for them, they had to look just 10 miles south-east to the city of Sunderland. Newcastle's rivalry with Sunderland dates way further back than football though. The two cities truly hate each other. It's believed the rivalry dates back nearly 400 years to the English Civil War, with the city of Newcastle having been given perks and economic boosts due to the fact it had been highly royalist. This meant people in Sunderland had been forced into poverty, and the locals grew a distaste for their neighbours, which only incubated further as time went on, before exploding in size due to professional football in the area. It was in 1894 when Newcastle would switch to their now famous black and white stripes, leading to the creation of their nickname, the Magpies. It was around this time that attendances would start to pick up, and now the team's backstory's been laid out, the real story can begin. Fast forward 9 years and Newcastle found themselves in the first division of English football, after 2 promotions in 6 years between 1892 and 1898. By the end of the 1903-04 season, Newcastle had finished 4th, finishing the top 4 for the second time in 3 years. Going into the 1904-05 season, Newcastle were looking to win their first major honour, with the club also having failed to make an impact in cup competitions, being knocked out in the first round of the FA Cup in the last 2 campaigns. Sadly for Newcastle though, they'd be without starman Bill Appleyard, who would suffer injuries throughout the campaign. Luckily though, the Toon had managed to get fine without him, finding themselves top of the table with just 1 game to go. That final game would be against none other than Sunderland. At this point, Sunderland were one of the most successful teams in England and had already won the first division 4 times. They were the more decorated and respected club at the time and were only a few places behind them in the table, meaning it would be far from an easy game. Going into the match, Newcastle had won 5 from their last 6. Meanwhile, Sunderland were completely winless. The game would be played at St James's Park and would offer the first opportunity for the now iconic stadium to see silverware. 90 minutes later, they'd lost 3-1, and the title was out of their hands. I'm sure everyone watching this video will remember Sergio Aguero's last-minute goal in 2012, which won Man City their first ever Premier League title on the final day. But what if I told you their first title drama on the final day had actually occurred over a century beforehand, as they beat Everton 2-0 at home, handing Newcastle their first ever piece of silverware, in the most dramatic fashion. By the 1909-10 campaign, Newcastle had won the league 3 times, and had made the FA Cup final another 3 times, finishing as runners-up on each occasion. The world's oldest competition was the missing gem of Newcastle's trophy cabinet, with the club having even won the Charity Shield by this point, which was introduced in just 1908. Newcastle had pretty much sacrificed the league, but had made the FA Cup final once again, this time determined not to lose it. However, in the 37th minute, Newcastle conceded to opponents Barnsley, and is a familiar story for Newcastle, even up to the modern era. As I mentioned, Newcastle had already lost 3 FA Cup finals by this stage, and Barnsley were making that 4. Then came Jock Rutherford with a few minutes left on the clock, who equalised for the Toon, sending the Geordie fans into delirium and the game to a replay. On the 28th of April 1910, Newcastle beat Barnsley 2-0 in the replay, winning their first ever FA Cup after years of pain. Moving forward a little, and in 1925, Neil Harris became the first Magpie to reach 100 goals, writing himself into the club's history and becoming one of, if not the first, legendary number 9. I bring this up because the number 9 shirt became legendary for Newcastle, with many of the club's greatest ever players wearing it, so keep your eyes peeled for its relevance in this video. After this season, Harris would leave, being replaced by Hughie Gallagher, with the club having won nothing but a single FA Cup in the last 14 years. Gallagher would settle in great at Newcastle, scoring 23 goals in his debut season at the Toon. It would be in his second year where he'd have his greatest season, however, firing the club to a 4th league title and their highest ever points tally, scoring a remarkable 39 goals in the process. Leaving after just 5 years in 1930, Gallagher scored 143 goals for Newcastle at a rate of 0.82 per game, still to the day the club's best goals to game ratio. Gallagher was now Newcastle's record scorer and would stay that way for nearly 3 decades. After being relegated for the first time ever in 1934, Newcastle spent a few years in the second division before the goals of Jackie Milburn would help to get the club promoted, keep them up, and win another 3 FA Cups before he left the club in 1957. Not only this, but Milburn also became Newcastle's highest scorer of all time, notching 200 goals, making him the first player to do so in the black and white stripes of the Toon. Milburn leaving was like a metaphor for the success of the club, as after he left the team went through an extreme dry spell. The 1968-69 season saw Newcastle come 9th in the league, however they had qualified for the Intercities Fairs Cup. In the first round, Newcastle came up against Feyenoord, who that season would go on to win the Dutch league. The Magpies would come out on top 4-2 over 2 legs, and came up against Sporting Club in the next round. The Geordies would scrape through 2-1 on aggregate, with a 1-0 away win in the second leg being enough to secure a spot in the next round. Their next opponents would be Real Zaragoza, who were in the middle of their golden era, having won the Copa del Rey twice in the previous few seasons. It would take a mammoth effort from the boys in black and white to go through, but they just about managed it, squeezing through the 4-4 tie on away goals. Having made the quarters, the Geordie fans were starting to believe they could make it the whole way and win the competition, but they faced tough competition against a Vittoria side which had just knocked Italian giants Fiorentina out in the last 16. Newcastle won the first leg 5-1, breezing through to the semis. The semi-final would be an all-British affair, facing Rangers. The first leg was extremely tight, with a 0-0 draw taking place at the Ibrox, meaning St James's Park would be hosting its most important game yet on the 21st of May 1969. If Newcastle won, they'd find themselves in their first ever European final. At half-time the score was still level at 0-0, with nerves starting to creep in for the home fans. They hadn't seen their team win anything in 14 years and had seen the side they loved bottle it at the final hurdle so many times in the past. Then, goals from James Scott and John Sinclair would win Newcastle the game, and just like that, the Magpies were flying high in Europe. In the final they'd come up against Hungarian side Újpest, who had won the 1969 league season, starting a decade of pure domination in Hungary. But Newcastle had faced the hardest run of anybody in the competition, and thus believed they could beat anyone that faced them. The final would be in 2 legs, with the fixture coming to St James's Park first. Newcastle won 3-0 at home. The Toon had a significant advantage going into the second leg, and there was no way they could possibly bottle it now. By half-time, Newcastle had seen their lead shrink down to just 1 goal, and were really struggling to stay in the game. After facing so many of Europe's best teams to make it to the final, it looked like Newcastle were about to throw it all away. Then in the 46th minute, another goal went in, but Newcastle had scored it. 4 minutes later, and they scored again, making it 2-2 on the day and 5-2 in aggregate. Then in the 74th minute, Alan Shearer, who'd just been subbed on, scored, making it 3-2 to Newcastle and sealing the win. Newcastle were champions, becoming one of the earliest English teams to ever win a European trophy. Sadly for the Magpies though, this would be their only relative success in a huge dry period for the club. Between the years of 1951 and 1983, the club didn't finish in the top 4 of the First Division once. However, at the start of the 82-83 season, Newcastle had signed global superstar Kevin Keegan, who'd been one of the very few players to venture outside of England. At the time, Newcastle were actually in the second tier of English football, and in his second and final season at the club, Keegan scored 27 goals and got the Geordies promoted back to the First Division. It'd be in the upcoming 84-85 season where Newcastle fans would see the first of a young star set to bring glory back to the city. His name? Paul Gascoigne. By the 85-86 season, an 18-year-old Gazza would have broken into the Newcastle starting 11. Gascoigne made 31 appearances in the league, scoring 9 times and helping Newcastle to an 11th place finish. The next season, Gascoigne wouldn't be able to play as many games, limited to just 24 appearances, where he'd be able to just about keep the Toon up, finishing the season in 17th, just 2 spots above the relegation zone. The 87-88 season would see Gascoigne play his best football yet, with club legend Jackie Milburn saying that Gazza was the best player in the world. Gascoigne linked up with Mirandinha, the first Brazilians to play in England, as Newcastle finished 8th and had made it to the 5th round of the FA Cup, the furthest they'd made it in 12 years and their highest league position in 11. Sadly though, having become a fan favourite, Gascoigne was unlucky to come through at the club during a time of financial hardship. Newcastle would be forced into selling their star man for £2.2 million, a British record fee. The following season Newcastle would be relegated, winning none of their final 9 games, crashing out of the first tier. The loss of Gascoigne was like having the heart ripped out of the club. Newcastle fans had been able to dream of success once again with Gascoigne out on the pitch, but without him, they seemed hopeless. In 1992, with Newcastle still in the second tier, English football changed forever. The 92-93 season would be the first of the brand new Premier League. The Prem brought money, fame, global coverage and so much more to English football, and every owner wanted their team competing in it. In 1992, Sir John Hall had bought Newcastle, bringing in Kevin Keegan as manager in February. After a terrible season, Newcastle won the final 2 games of the campaign, keeping them up by just 4 points. Reminder, Newcastle had never played 3rd division football in their entire 100 plus year existence, and this was by far the closest they'd ever come. Going into the 92-93 season, Newcastle had invested, but there was no way they'd be able to build a proper squad, capable of turning the ship around. Never mind. In just one full season, Kevin Keegan had got Newcastle back to the 1st division, and up into the Premier League for the first time ever. Having invested in the squad with players like Andy Cole and the return of Peter Beardsley, Newcastle meant business. After a rocky start to the season, from the 30th of October onwards, Newcastle were brilliant, finishing 3rd in their first season back with the big boys. The next season, Newcastle would impress once again, finding themselves top of the league for the first 14 games of the season, and even stayed in the title race until a shock Andy Cole transfer to Man United in January left them without their biggest goal threat. Cole had been the top scorer in the Prem the season before, scoring 34 goals, which to this day is still the highest ever Prem goal tally. With their talisman having left, Newcastle's form fell off a cliff, ending the season in 6th and not even qualifying for the UEFA Cup. Going into the 95-96 season, Newcastle had invested heavily once again, signing Les Ferdinand as a replacement for Andy Cole, as well as David Ginola, David Batty and Warren Barton. The new signings gelled instantly and the team started the season brilliantly, hitting top of the table from the first game of the season and had built a 10-point lead by Christmas. Newcastle continued their form, and with just 14 games left, they were 9 points clear of United with a game in hand. This is where things got sticky. Newcastle won just 2 of their next 8, and by the 8th of April, Man United had taken the top spot outright. To rub salt in their wounds, Andy Cole would score a pivotal goal in United's 3-2 win against Man City to take them top. Fast forward to the end of April, and after a 1-0 win against Leeds, Newcastle had clawed themselves back level with United, where Kevin Keegan for some reason lost it, saying that infamous line.
And I'll tell you, honestly, I will love it if we beat them. Love it.
Oh my God, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the...
It's fair to say that one line cursed Newcastle on the spot, as they went on to drop points against mid-table Forest and Spurs, losing the title by 4 points as Man United took home their 3rd Premier League. Once again, Newcastle started the 96-97 season well, being top of the league after 14 games, but couldn't keep it up, with Kevin Keegan resigning as manager in January, stating it wasn't what was best for him during that period of his life. Newcastle would once again finish 2nd despite having signed the great Alan Shearer at the start of the campaign. After this point, Newcastle's story for the next few years was less about succeeding as a team, and more just Shearer carrying them on his back year after year, with the boyhood Newcastle fan finishing as the Magpies' top scorer for every single season he was at the club. In 2006, after 10 years at the club, Alan Shearer retired, with Newcastle having finished in the top 4 just twice in the final 9 seasons Shearer would play, never winning a single piece of silverware. It would only be a team trophy that Shearer would miss out on at Newcastle though, as the man wouldn't stop scoring, finishing his time at Newcastle with 206 goals, become the club's greatest ever goal scorer, and become the Premier League's top scorer of all time. 2 years later, Newcastle were bought by an exotic billionaire who supposedly supported them, although there's rumours he was actually a Spurs fan, looking to bring the team back to the top. Just joking, Mike Ashley bought the club, and he turned it into a very successful money-making machine. Now I'm sure everyone knows enough about Mike Ashley's time at Newcastle, so I'll just do a small recap. In the 14 years Mike Ashley owned Newcastle, the club smashed their record transfer fee, signing Mike Keegan before then disrespected the club to the fans, came back got relegated, came back and brought back Shearer as a 5 years, disrespected the club to the fans, got promoted again, did nothing for everywhere across New going back down. And then finally, in late 2021, Mike Ashley sold the club. I think it's fair to say, Mike Ashley's time in the North East was fairly turbulent, don't you? But even throughout this incredibly volatile time at the club, one thing was steady as a rock. The Toonami backed the club no matter what. Pretty much every game for Ashley's entire 14-year spell at the club saw Newcastle fans near selling out their stadium, even averaging over 50,000 fans a week in the Championship. Now, as much as I'm sure those Geordie fans won't like me saying it, Mike Ashley did technically see Newcastle end their league title drought, as they won the Championship twice. I'm joking. But what's not a joke is the amount of money Newcastle have. Well, actually, I guess you could say it's an absolute joke, as they are so much richer than everyone else. I'm getting off topic. I'm not here to talk about the ethics behind the new owners of Newcastle. It's already been spoken about by people a lot smarter than I am. What I will say is that Newcastle mean business. They've already made numerous impressive signings, and as of writing they find themselves in the top 4, with the joint fewest number of losses in the league. Having not won a trophy of note since the 2006 Intertoto Cup, Newcastle look like they might be about to change that. Like it or not, Newcastle United are going to the very top, and they'll be there to stay. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. I'll be doing more videos like this on the channel, especially while the World Cup's on, so make sure you keep your eyes on the community tab if you want to vote on the topics I cover next. Please like and comment if you did enjoy the video, and subscribe if you're new, but most importantly, enjoy your day.